This is Christopher Sernaque hosting episode 10 of season 4 of the Current Topics in Science podcast. This podcast will address breaking scientific news in light of the origins debate and host interviews with scientists. This podcast is available on the following platforms: iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Video recordings of the podcast will be uploaded to YouTube. Enjoy the podcast. Today on Current Topics in Science, we have the honor of hosting Ben Kissling. Ben obtained his Bachelor of Science degree in Biochemistry from the University of Nebraska and is currently working on his Master of Arts degree in Science and Religion at Biola University. In his experience as a biochemist, Ben has worked in numerous laboratories. He's also worked as a high school science teacher. He was at one point a youth pastor, and now his passion for Christ Jesus continues as he teaches origin science. He has a series of lectures that he's given that have all been uploaded online. His lecture series, called Creation, Evolution, and Intelligent Design, currently has 9 installments, and his other lecture series, Reviewing the Views of Dr. William Lane Craig, currently has 13 installments. And today, on this episode of Current Topics in Science, we'll be reviewing what evidences from science have persuaded Ben to hold the views that he does, and we'll be examining whether or not Dr. Craig's work is accurate in light of Scripture and science. And now, without further ado, good morning, Ben. How was your day, and how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Chris, and it's great to be here. As I told you before, it's an honor to be on your podcast, and you do a great job. You do your homework, and you really know what you're talking about. We need more of that in this space, so thanks for having me on.
Ben, it's a pleasure to have you on Current Topics in Science. And since this is Current Topics in Science, we're going to quickly look at this week's current topic. So we're going to be checking out this article from News Medical Life Science called The Biochemistry of Cloning. This article states that molecular cloning is a technique used to create DNA experimental tools that are expressed in either bacterial or mammalian cells. Molecular cloning is defined as the isolation and amplification of a target DNA sequence. There are 3 types of enzymes used for cloning. These include restriction, endonucleases, polymerases, nucleases, ligases, kinases, and phosphatases. Restriction endonucleases are bacterial enzymes that cleave double-stranded DNA either at or near recognition sites in nucleic acid molecules, known as restriction sites. So Ben, what did you think of this current topic, and can you tell us about your own personal experience studying and working as a biochemist?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know most people, when they think of the word cloning, they think of, making complete copies of human beings, right? I'm beside myself or whatever. But the word cloning is not really it's a word that's used very commonly in science, and it's done very commonly. And it just means sort of what the article describes, that you're taking DNA from one source and putting it in another source. The first lab I worked in, we did a lot of a procedure called PCR, which is the amplification procedure, where you take a certain part of DNA and you have an artificial procedure using a special polymerase called Taq polymerase that can operate at higher temperatures than most polymerases. And so you use the temperature cycling. We don't want to get into too many details here, but basically you have markers on either side of the section of DNA that you're looking for that are specifically for that section. And then you just replicate inside those 2 markers over and over and over again. And so you get a bunch of copies of the section of DNA that you want to look at. And then all the rest of the DNA kind of gets overwhelmed by all the copies of the section that you're looking at. And that's called amplification, or PCR amplification. So I worked in a soybean genetics lab that did a lot of that. And they were looking for polymorphisms in the DNA. That's kind of an older technique. I've done newer techniques of where it's called vector transformation, which I think was talked about a little bit in that article. But it uses a newer technique, uses electroporation, which is a fancy word for shocking a bunch of bacteria with electricity to create pores in the membrane so that the DNA that you want to get in there will go in through the membrane. And usually that's done with plasmids, which aren't always incorporated into the host's DNA, because a bacteria that has no nucleus has a different kind of DNA. So you can just put a little plasmid in there and it'll work just fine. So you don't really necessarily need restriction enzymes for that. But cloning can mean a ton of different things. I also worked in a lab that helped produce vaccines, where, yeah, and this is a long time ago now, but basically there's biofermenters that are the same kind of machine that you use to make beer or alcohol, where you grow bacteria on whatever grain you're using, and the bacteria ferment the grain and produce alcohol as a waste product. Well, there's a way to produce vaccines the same way that involves cloning them with the DNA that gives you the vaccine sequence. And you put that into the bacteria and ferment it in a biofermenter. They're literally called biofermenters, even though it's not really fermentation, like in the alcohol sense, but they call it fermentation because it's the same process. And you grow them and they produce a whole bunch of the vaccine that you want. And you literally, undo a nozzle and the bacteria sort of oozes out, and we collected it in Ziploc bags and then froze it. And then you take it to the protein purification lab where they purify the product out of all the other stuff that's in there. So yeah, I've done a lot of stuff like that in a lot of different laboratories and a lot of different contexts. And cloning is it's something scientists do all the time. But, they have cloned animals, as we all know, like, remember Dolly the sheep. And they've also cloned dogs with an invention or a discovery of another one of the guests on your podcast, Robert Carter. He has a patent on a fluorescent jellyfish protein. And you can actually move the fluorescent jellyfish protein into like a dog's DNA and have it express it in its fur and its skin and have a glow in the dark dog. Right. But the problem with that, especially with humans, is that you destroy a ton of embryos when you do that, at least in the method that I know about, because it's very difficult to get the DNA to go into the right place in the host DNA. And that's kind of what you want to try and use restriction enzymes for, is cut the DNA at a specific place to get your vector into the right place in the host DNA. But that's very hard to do, and it doesn't work often because a lot of times it'll go to the wrong place and mess something up, and the embryo will die then. So cloning in general, especially with bacteria, is not difficult to do. It's more difficult with eukaryotic cells that have a nuclear membrane. And we did some of that in the vaccine lab that I worked at. We had a eukaryotic model system called Pichia pastoris, which is a yeast cell that they did some work with. They also had CHO cells, which are Chinese hamster ovary cells, for mammalian applications, but I never used that when I was there. It's rare that you actually need to do that. It's much easier to work with Pichia if you need a eukaryotic model system. So, and we did most vaccines are really simple. They don't need a lot of like folding and stuff like that. So most of the time it works in bacteria.
That's really amazing, Ben. If you don't mind me sort of going off script a little bit, no, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about this. So, like, what kinds of vaccines are made at those biofermentation facilities, like the ones for chicken pox? Or what kinds end up being there?
The lab I worked at was not a big one, and it was involved in development of processes for making vaccines. So we weren't actually producing vaccines that would get used by people. What our lab was doing was taking a laboratory procedure where they discovered the vaccine and scaling it up so that it could be mass produced, basically, is where the lab I worked in was focused on. And they had a lot of Army contracts. And so we worked with ricin vaccines, is one people would recognize. So that was kind of cool. And because we had, federal defense contracts, I had to get fingerprinted, and there was fingerprint access into the lab. It's kind of cool, but it's we had other types of, I can't remember specific other ones except for ricin, because that's one you don't forget, right? But I think they may have done a smallpox one. The normal like flu shot vaccine is probably produced usually in chicken eggs, which is a completely different procedure than what we were doing. And of course, the COVID-19 vaccine is also completely different. So there are lots of different ways of doing it.
Wow. Ben, thank you so much for sharing your experience. While you were talking, that sort of reminded me of the fifth question from the 15 Questions for Evolutionists campaign that Creation Ministries International did. So their question was, how did these new biochemical pathways originate? So Ben, in other words, it sounds like the origin of biochemical pathways is a problem for the evolutionary theory. And I'm wondering, can you tell us what biochemical evidence convinced you of the veracity of the intelligent design and creation models?
Okay, well, I don't think one particular thing changed my mind. I've always been a young Earth creationist. I grew up as a young Earth creationist. But so I would have had to have been convinced away from that position, just as a matter of my personal history. But one example that I really loved growing up in high school was when I read Darwin's Black Box by Michael Behe, as I think like a junior in high school. My dad gave that to me, and I read that, and I remember being just blown away by the complexity of these biochemical pathways that I never knew anything about until I read his book. And especially the blood clotting cascade was really interesting to me. Of course, later on, kind of the bacterial flagellum became the big hobby horse that everyone argued about. But for me, it was really the blood clotting cascade that he talked about in that book. Because before I read that, I thought that when you got a cut and the blood turned into a scab on your skin, I thought that was just the water evaporating. Like I thought it just dried up, and that's what caused blood clotting. But when I read that book, I was like, oh my gosh, there's all this complex stuff that has to go into that, because you have to like have this whole thing where it makes sure that the clotting starts on the skin. And so there's a factor on the skin that starts the whole thing, and that it doesn't start when it's inside your body, because that would be really bad. And you have to have it start at the right place and stop at the right place, and all this stuff. And it's not just enough to have the blood dry out, it doesn't just happen. So, the blood clotting cascade was really an eye opener for me personally.
Thank you so much for addressing those biochemical evidences for design, Ben. Speaking of which, before we change gears and we start looking at Dr. Craig's book, In Quest of the Historical Atom, we should take a look at your lecture series, which you have published online on your YouTube channel, Ben Kissling. Ben, can you give us an overview of your lecture series and what can someone expect from watching them?
Yeah, my pastor knew that I was big into this stuff because we do a Bible study every other week now. But so he kind of got tired of listening to me spout off on creation science and Bible study. And so he asked me to teach a Sunday school class on it. And so I approached it as more explanatory rather than arguing for a position, trying to be more of a teacher. So I structured it as 2 lessons per creation, evolution, intelligent design. First, giving the history of each one in the first lesson, and then a more scientific explanation in the second lesson. And then I did sort of a broad, basic history of and philosophy of science, sort of bookending all of that. So I start with the history of science, then I go into 2 lessons on creation science, 2 lessons on evolution and 2 lessons on intelligent design, and then end with a philosophy of science lecture. So, and my pastor said it was the best he'd ever seen on that topic. And we ended up doing an extra lesson in there. So we ended up doing 9 actually. So I think the extra one I did on evolution, on evolutionary stuff. So even if you don't agree with our position here, it would be interesting to you, I think, to well, I think there's something in there that you could learn from, no matter what your view is.
Amen. I appreciate that, Ben. And for those listening, Ben also has a series on some of the material we'll be covering today on Dr. William Lane Craig. It's going to be available in the description along with Ben's review of his book, which we're going to be going over in the second half of this interview. Now, Ben, obviously, neither you nor I have any personal animosity towards Dr. Craig, and we're not here to attack him as an individual. You know, he's done a lot of good work, and I know I've watched a lot of his material and his information, and I've enjoyed his apologetic arguments for God's existence. However, in this new book of his, he's not making the case for God's existence. But before we get into his book, can you tell us a little bit more about him for maybe people who don't know of him as a person? And can you give some context, Ben, for the book In Quest of the Historical Atom?
Yeah, for sure. No, Craig's a great guy. He's very personable, and he's done a lot of work that he puts out for free, which is part of the reason why, I got attracted to his stuff in the first place. Is when I was researching for that Sunday school class, I came across his Defenders 3 series, Excursus on Creation of Life and Biological Diversity, which again, he puts out for free, right? And so not everyone does that. And so I really appreciate that. And there's a lot of stuff I agree with in that lecture series. And so he spent most of 2019 doing that. And 2019 was when I did this Sunday school series. And Craig's foray into this area is, again, he admits, is outside his area of interest, even, and expertise. But because he has a goal of writing a systematic theology, which he's doing right now, he wanted to shore up areas of weakness for him, which again is admirable. Not a lot of people are going to do that, right? I'm not sure I would do that. Like, I'm interested in this one topic, and it's kind of an area of pretty intense focus for me. But Craig, he wants to be the expert on everything. And so he went to 2 areas that he felt were weaknesses for him, which was atonement theory, and he wrote a book on that, and also the historical atom stuff, and he wrote a book on that. So you could kind of see in real time him in that class, especially in the class before he wrote the book. You could see him sort of in real time starting to deal with the depth of the issue and some of the problems that are involved with it. And he admits he began to struggle with it. Again, which, as an intellectually honest person, I would expect him to struggle with it from an old earth perspective. And he did. And that's to his credit, So my initial thoughts on the book, I guess. I did want a whole video on an initial response after I read the book last fall. A lot of it was not a surprise to me because I had watched the Defenders 3 series. But the things that were a little bit of a surprise to me were arguments that he backed off of from the class, where he kind of realized that, maybe this is a little more controversial than I thought at first, and I'm not sure I want to strongly assert this. And in particular, his argument that Genesis 1 and 2 are separate and contradictory creation accounts. That's a common argument, as you well know, that comes up online all the time. And Craig really, initially, he was trying to argue in the class, or at least it seemed to me that he was, that Genesis 1 and 2 were, because they're contradictory creation accounts, they count as completely separate creation myths. And that is evidence that the original authors did not believe they were historical, because otherwise, why would they put in contradictory stories? If they thought the stories were true, they would not have put in the contradictions. And he sort of backed off of that a little bit in the book, and changed the argument in subtle ways that I thought were really interesting. Other initial thoughts were, again, there's a lot to like about the book. There's a lot that young Earth creationists agree with, particularly his criticisms of other old Earth views. He came out very strongly against Hugh Ross's claim that the Genesis account is talking about a local flood, which was a surprise to me, that he came out that strongly against Hugh Ross's position. Craig has often turned to Hugh Ross for criticisms of young Earth creationism and for other views, and it shows up in the class. He even recommends Ross's book in the class. But in the book, the thing he spends the most time on Ross is a criticism of the local flood interpretation. So that was a bit of a surprise to me, and a positive thing. So, I mean, initial thoughts. It's funny because I didn't really have initial thoughts about the book, because I had been interacting with Craig's thought for 2 years before the book came out. So most of my thoughts are not really initial.
Yeah, I really appreciated everything you shared there, Ben. And I was actually surprised to also see that the local flood idea was actually criticized as well, because normally that's a key. I believe it was Dr. Marcus Ross who said that the Genesis flood wipes away millions of years of time, and those millions of years are necessary for evolution. So, no millions of years, no evolution.
Yeah, because it's the flood that creates the rock record, and that's where the age of the Earth calculations mostly come from, is from the radiometric dating of the rock record. But if that was all laid down during a global flood, it happened just like that. So
Exactly. Well, like you said, we could sort of like go through all day each of the book, but we can't go through each of those arguments. But can you tell us what was basically the main thesis of the inquest of the historical Adam? And do you believe this thesis lines up with the scriptures?
yeah, so his main thesis is that the historical Adam exists, which does line up with the scriptures, right? That's the traditional position. So he thinks that the historical Adam was a member of a species called Homo heidelbergensis, which is not the typical view that you usually hear from old earthers. But he makes the case that humanity goes all the way back to about 750,000 years ago, at least, if not a million years ago. And again, that's not Hugh Ross's view. That's not the typical theistic evolution view, or even old Earth creation view. Most views on that score argue for a more recent advent of humanity. So, for example, in November, when I attended the Evangelical Theological Society panel on Craig's book, there was a theistic evolutionist there named Michael Murray, who made a strong argument that humanity began 100 to 200,000 years ago. And so that was a big point of difference with Dr. Craig. And so that's probably his main thesis, is that Adam and Eve came from this population that are much older than other old Earth views usually have them.
Thanks for going over the main thesis of Craig's argument, Ben. And so now let's take a look at more of the specific arguments. Some of the points or the arguments that were raised in the book for rejecting the historicity of the first 11 chapters of Genesis, they've been cited by others in the past, such as how could it be possible for the longer lifespans to have happened? But when you were reviewing the book, did you find any newer ideas or any objections to the 6,000-year timescale that stood out to you? And if so, what did you think about Craig's reasons to reject a historical reading of the first 11 chapters of Genesis?
Yeah, and that's one thing that got me interested into Craig's ideas, is that there were some novel arguments in there that I had not seen before. And part of it is that I had always kind of assumed that Craig was an old Earth creationist, And generally, there are about 3 categories here. There's young Earth creationists, there's old Earth creationists, and then there's theistic evolutionists. But Craig doesn't appear to totally fall into the old Earth creationist category the way I thought he did. And that is mainly due to his biblical interpretation. When it comes to biblical interpretation, Craig is more on the side of a theistic evolutionist, whereas his scientific interpretation, which is more like his actual view of progressive creation, it would be more categorized as an old Earth creationist. But Craig has some legitimate objections to old Earth creationist interpretations of the Bible, because he calls a lot of those views concordist, which is the same objection that a young Earth creationist would have, is that you are inputting scientific information into your interpretation of the text, and you shouldn't do that. That's improper hermeneutics, as Craig knows. And so he went more the theistic evolution route, interpreting the Bible and saying that this is the whole thing, rather than saying like there's a gap between the first 2 verses of Genesis, or the days of Genesis 1 are long periods, or some other version of that kind of interpretation. Craig just wipes all of those away and says those are all concordist interpretations. The best way to interpret the text is that the whole thing, Genesis 1 through 11, is a myth. It's a story, and the days of creation are 24-hour days in the story. He makes that argument in the book. The flood is a global flood within the story, and he makes the distinction between truth in a story versus actual history. So I can say to you truthfully that Thanos snapped his fingers and killed 50% of all life in the universe. Well, we know that didn't actually happen, right? But I'm not lying to you, because that's what happened in the story, in the fictional story. And so from Craig's point of view, the global flood is true in the story, but not historical. And that's his main argument that I found interesting, is he's trying to find a conservative, theologically and biblically orthodox way of interpreting Genesis 1 through 11 as a fictional story, which usually when you hear that kind of interpretation, it's almost always from a theistic evolutionist. And it's almost always a more liberal interpretation where they're kind of throwing up their hands and saying, well, there might be things that are wrong in the Bible. Craig's priority is to preserve divine inspiration and biblical inerrancy. And he is trying to do that by interpreting Genesis 1 through 11 as a mythical story. And so that's what kind of attracted to me, is kind of an interesting view that I'd not really engaged with much before, because most of the time people who take Craig's style of interpretation aren't concerned with preserving biblical inerrancy and things like that. Unfortunately, many of what ends up happening in the actual details of the interpretation is either Craig admits ignorance of what the text means, or he relies on arguments that I've heard before, in specific arguments about what the genealogies mean. But there were a few novel arguments, like his argument about the cherubim I'd never heard before. And in the book, he says he gets that from a Jewish scholar named Sarn or something like that. I might be getting the name wrong, but anyway, so the argument is really convoluted. But basically, he says that the ancient Israelites interpreted the second commandment as to prohibit all sculptures of any real creatures. In other words, they were allowed to make sculptures of fake creatures or imaginary creatures. But if it was a real creature, they couldn't make a sculpture of it or something, because that would be a violation of the second commandment. When normally you would interpret the second commandment as being against making idols for worship, for purposes of worshiping as a god, as a false god, right? So what Craig does with that, though, is he turns it into an argument that the cherubim that God placed at the entrance to the garden to prevent Adam and Eve from going back in were not real creatures. Why? Because the Israelites put cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant in Exodus. So they were totally fine with making sculptures of cherubim on the lid of the Ark of the Covenant. And if you remember, their wings are outstretched and their tips of their wings touch in the center, and that forms the Bema seat, the mercy seat, where God's presence is on the Ark. And Craig says because they did that, it shows that they believed that cherubim were not real creatures. And therefore, they would not have believed that there were actual cherubim placed at the entrance to the Garden of Eden. And therefore, that's evidence that the story was seen as mythical by the ancient Jews. And this is a huge distinction to understand right off the bat. Craig is arguing the way he should argue, which is this is what the ancient Hebrews believed the text to mean. Okay. Now, this is a problem with many other old earth views who basically go to the text and say, this is what it really means, right? But the ancient Hebrews could not have understood it that way because they didn't have the information we now have today from modern science. Craig takes the correct view that no, we need to interpret the text according to what they thought it meant. And so all of his arguments are designed to try and argue that the ancient Israelites, the ancient Hebrews, and the ancient author, which Craig seems to affirm a sort of vague version of the documentary hypothesis, which suggests multiple authors for the Pentateuch, but he doesn't take the classical position on that of the four groups. I don't remember the letters now, but there's 4 letters. But he says there are probably multiple authors. And so his goal is to say the authors, when they wrote this, meant it to be a myth. And this is one of the evidence that he uses. Now, Hans Madueme at the ETS panel made the same basic argument there that I would make and was making, that there are examples, pretty obvious examples in the rest of the Old Testament that show the Israelites had no problem making sculptures of real creatures, that's not what the second commandment actually meant. So for example, in Numbers 21, I believe, or 22, there's an episode which you'll immediately recognize as relevant, where the Israelites had made God mad again, and God was punishing them by sending venomous snakes into their camp. And the snakes were biting them, and people were dying from the poisonous snakes. And the people repent and they say, God, we're sorry, we want to get back in your good graces. And so God tells Moses to make a bronze sculpture of a snake and put it in the center of the camp. And then people would look at it and be healed of their venomous snake bites. And I actually had an opportunity to present that objection directly to Craig in person, over a Zoom class that he did at Houston Baptist University in October, which was actually before the ETS panel. So I paid a couple $100 and to audit the class, and we had a Zoom class with Dr. Craig in person, presenting his case for the book, and we got to ask him questions, and that's one of the questions I asked him, and he didn't have much of a response to that. Madueme did not bring up the Numbers 21 story. He brought up other examples, which I hadn't realized myself. And so I put that into the article, the review article that I wrote. I put both examples in there. The other example is, I think it's in Solomon's temple, when they make the bronze sea, which is like the ceremonial washing basin, and they put it on the backs of 12 bronze bowls. Sculptures of real creatures, and they don't seem to have a problem with that, and they don't seem to think that's a violation of the second commandment. And Madueme also pointed out that images of pomegranates were supposed to be woven into, I think, the priestly garments. It's either priestly garments or the curtains in the temple, or it might even be both, but and if you've read the Bible as much as I have, you remember talk of pomegranates and all this. And those are real, living things that were ordered, again, just like the cherubim. God ordered the Israelites to make images of these real creatures and put them into their into the tabernacle and the ark and the priestly garments and all this stuff. And it appears it's pretty clear that if you use the principle of interpreting scripture with other scripture, that the second commandment did not mean that you couldn't ever make sculptures of real creatures. And therefore, this is not a good argument that the cherubim, that the Israelites themselves did not see the cherubim as real creatures.
No, I really actually appreciated that, Ben. If you don't mind me making sort of an off-script comment or question, were there any other ones that like stood out to you like that, where it was like, oh wait, oh, I never heard that one before?
I mean, he goes through a whole thing about the genealogies, but he rejects all other interpretations of the genealogy and says we just don't know what they mean. And so I want to raise my hand and say, I know what they mean. They mean what it looks like it means, that the people actually live that long. So there's nothing really novel there. I thought that one of his major points about something called etiology was pretty novel and something I hadn't thought a lot about before in terms of the Genesis account. So he makes 10 points about the family resemblances between Genesis and other creation myths, trying to say that they're in the same genre, because his whole argument is based on a genre analysis of Genesis 1 through 11. And he says that, based on my genre analysis, we can say this is myth, and therefore it doesn't restrict any of our beliefs about the history of the world prior to Abraham. And therefore we can just believe whatever science comes up with, whatever it says, we can believe science, because all that 1 through 11 stuff is a myth, or most of it is, right? Because he wants to preserve the historical Adam. So he really kind of ends up tied up in knots around whether or not what aspects of the story are mythical and which are historical. But the interesting argument is about etiology, and that was really the etiological argument was really, I think, the strongest argument in the book for a mythical interpretation of Genesis. And etiology is a word that means a story that grounds present realities in the primordial past. So it's a story that attempts to explain current realities in terms of a past explanation. Like, this is how, and the way I thought of it was with Native American myths that I was actually taught growing up in public schools in the Midwest, where, that's part of our heritage. And so we were taught some Native American myths, and never in terms of these are true, right? But and I don't know if this is an actual Native American myth, but this is the one I remember, where how the rabbit got its fluffy tail, right? And so the story is like, well, the rabbit was running around and it was so fast that the fox could never catch it, and the rabbit started bragging and being boastful and saying, "You'll never catch me." And so the sun god comes in and says, "All right, I'm going to take the rabbit down a few pegs and teach it the rabbit a lesson and give it this big white fluffy tail. So now the fox can see it better and can actually catch it," right? And that's how the rabbit got its fluffy tail. And Craig uses a whole bunch of examples of other myths like this and tries to relate it to Genesis and say, this is what the ancient people, the ancient Israelites were doing. They were really just doing the same thing that all these other ancient peoples did when they were trying to explain the world they lived in. So they made up these stories that explain how the rabbit got its tail. And there is a really compelling example of this kind of story in Genesis with the snake. And this is, again, I think this is Craig's strongest argument, is that the idea that appears to be in Genesis is that the snake crawls along the ground because the snake tempted Eve, right? And deceived Eve, and God punished the snake for doing that. And now snakes slither on the ground. And so he's not saying that that is actually how snakes came to be, right? He doesn't believe that. But he is saying that, this must be what the story meant to the ancient people. Okay, it's an etiological myth in that it grounds what we see today in the primordial past and it explains it. Very similar to the way a scientific theory would explain how things came about today by saying, well, there was this big bang in the past and it exploded and all this stuff happened and that's how we got here today, right? It's something that you can't prove is true, but it explains things about our world today. And that's the problem right there, right? Is if the ancient people actually did believe that that was the way it happened, that snakes don't have legs because of that, and if the whole of 1 through 11 is an etiological myth in that same sense, what that means is the ancient peoples may very well have believed that that is the way things happened, and that is why they wrote that down. But Craig is saying that's not the way things happen. And so is he arguing that the Bible is wrong? That is a a difficult thing to navigate. Is how do you argue that the ancient Hebrews believed that these were etiological myths that actually do explain the present realities that they saw in the world, and simultaneously claim that it is somehow correct? So how is it that an ancient people wrote this history down, and and they meant it to explain present realities, but not really? Like that was the strongest argument in Craig's book, but it had this debilitating problem that Craig never really addresses. That when you're reading it, you're kind of like, okay, that kind of makes sense, but doesn't that mean that it's wrong? Like, if that's the case, then how did everything come to be the way it is? And if Craig has a different story for that, which he is taking from science, how is it that he claims that this story in the Bible is still true? He doesn't have an alternative interpretation for that story or the flood story, or well, most of the details in the flood story are not in Craig's interpretation, or the genealogies, which are, at least 2 chapters out of 11. It's kind of like at the end of the day, Craig never claims to have an actual hermeneutic of Genesis 1 through 11. Everything he says is, this is a genre analysis, which is the first step in a proper hermeneutic, but it's not the last step. The last step is to build an actual interpretation of what the text means, and Craig never does that. And it's like, if you don't have an alternate interpretation, you're not even playing on the same field as young earth creationists are, because we have an actual interpretation of the text. And if you don't have an alternate interpretation, you're basically making an argument from ignorance. Like, we don't know what it means, so it puts no restrictions on what we believe. And that's Craig's purpose, is to Craig wants to remove intellectual barriers to becoming a Christian. That's his goal as an apologist. He's stated that before. And his whole career, that's what he has tried to do, is remove intellectual barriers to becoming a Christian for a non-believer. And so the fact that he didn't come up with an alternative interpretation means that he couldn't find one.
I'm trying to think, like, that was an interesting take. Like, I've heard people try to say Genesis is poetry or parabolic before, but they've never made the argument quite like Craig did there concerning the snake, where he's trying to say, oh, like, this is an element of this kind of literature, and therefore this must be this kind of literature. What I wanted to ask you is sort of along the lines of, and I'm just trying to piece my thoughts together here. Basically, like, historical accounts, though, sometimes do have elements of other literature in them, right? So say, for example, we're writing the story of Abraham Lincoln's life. Well, Abraham Lincoln was married, right? And so there might be some elements of romance in the story of his life. But then to say, well, Abraham Lincoln maybe must have been a figure in a romantic novel, and so women typically like men with prestige or intelligence position, and so since there's romance involved in here, Abraham Lincoln, he must not have existed. This must have been just a romantical story. So it's like, am I making sense here?
Yeah, no, I get exactly what you're saying. And the interesting part about that is that Craig actually makes arguments that undermine that approach that you're talking about, where he has sort of made criticisms of other views that kind of prevent him from going the route that you just suggested. And it has to do with the concept of parallelomania, which is a word that he used in the class and again in the book. This is an argument he made in both the class and the book, that the polemic interpretation of Genesis, which is another theistic evolutionary type interpretation, which is probably baseless. And the theological polemic interpretation of Genesis is different than the etiological interpretation, because the theological polemic interpretation basically says that the early chapters of Genesis are designed by the ancient Hebrews as basically an argument against pagan gods. And they say, look, your pagan creation myth has got it all wrong, and here's a satirical sort of derivative story of what creation myth actually would have been like if the real God, Yahweh, had done it. And so it's a way of claiming that Genesis 1 through 11 is a fictional story, but is not etiological at all. It's a polemic against other creation myths. And it incorporates arguments, which Craig deals with directly in the book and in the class, that try to argue that there are certain aspects of these other creation myths that are referenced in Genesis, right? Just like what you suggested, that indicate that Genesis is in that genre of literature, of a theological polemic, where it's taking aspects of other creation myths, incorporating it into the Genesis account in a way, and then sort of either making fun of it or turning it around so that it's Yahweh doing those things instead of these other pagan gods. And Craig argues that pretty vociferously, again, similar to arguments that young earth creationists would make, that those types of parallels in the text are impossible to prove and impossible to show. In many cases, they're undermined by good textual criticism based on the dates when the texts were written. Another thing is you can't tell if it's really an element from another text, or if that text influenced the other text, or which text influenced which one. And it's really an exercise in trying to psychoanalyze ancient authors when you can't really know what they were thinking in those sort of abstract terms, like trying to read between the lines of what they were saying, really. And so he calls all these arguments of trying to find parallels between Genesis and other ancient creation myths, or maybe romances, right? He criticizes it as parallelomania, as kind of an imaginative, speculative, but mostly subjective and baseless attempt to find connections that aren't really there, right? And I found this interesting because it's very similar to an argument that C.S. Lewis made about the Gospels, where he basically said the same thing. And Lewis related it to Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And he said, is that when Lord of the Rings came out, all the critics thought that the Ring of Power, the one ring to rule them all, was a metaphor or a symbolic representation of nuclear weapons. And Lewis says, what could make more sense? After all, it's a weapon that would destroy everything if you used it, but it would be insane not to have it because it's so powerful, but you can't use it. And it's like the same as the ring, right? But then Lewis drops the hammer and he says, but I know personally, because I know Tolkien, that the Ring of Power was an element of his story decades before nuclear weapons were invented. And Lewis gives an example from his own Chronicles of Narnia, where, and his own experience as a fiction author, where critics will often write criticisms of, criticisms not as in this is bad, but criticisms as in I'm, explaining this fictional work. And they'll come up with these crazy theories about his own stories, like what his fictional or literature influences are and all the rest. And he, as the author, knows that they're all bunk. Like, and he even says that I on all of these types of interpretations, there is a record of 100% failure. Never once has a critic making that kind of argument ever been right. And you'd think, a blind squirrel could find a nut, or a broken clock could be right twice a day, but no, it's always wrong. and he says, but when it's an ancient document like one of the Gospels, and he's dealing here with actual biblical criticism that was, extant during Lewis's life, who are trying to claim that the Gospels were ancient romances or some kind of other kind of ancient fiction. And he says basically that, if critics today can't even figure out the actual influences of a story written in the same language, a living language, with the same cultural background as the author, and all the advantages that a critic would have, and yet they're always wrong, and I know it because I'm the author involved, how likely is it that we're able to make that kind of interpretation and be correct about an ancient people who are in a completely different culture with a completely different worldview, a different language that is now dead and has been dead for thousands of years? I mean, he says it's just impossible that anybody today living could actually do that kind of a thing and read between the lines of an ancient text. There's no way, according to Lewis. And Craig agrees with that, and so he sort of precludes that kind of interpretation of Genesis with that kind of argument. That is not a plausible argument to Craig, that there's some kind of influence in Genesis from other texts that show that it's similar to other fictional things. He really treats Genesis as its own text, as not derivative or of any other text, and just says, well, we can't say that it's like any other text or anything, but it looks like a myth. That's you'd expect better arguments from Craig, but he, because of his inexperience in this issue, I think he didn't realize where he was going with a lot of this. And at the end of the road, he kind of realized he'd painted himself into a corner. It's the kind of thing where you kind of wish that he'd be able to at least consider the young earth creationist interpretation, because it would solve a lot of the problems that he has correctly recognized. So including that one. So I hope that's what you were looking for.
That was perfect, Ben. Actually, it reminded me of an experience that I had. I was on a phone call with a pastor, and I had given him a book manuscript that I had written to read with my brother. And in the original prologue to the book, we had a conversation that I had with a doctor, one of actually the people I've interviewed. And then when he was reading the manuscript, he thought that the doctor was some kind of symbolic personification of my future self. And he was like, wow, that whole thing you did there with that symbolic doctor was great. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I was talking about a real person. He wasn't a symbol at all. So I know what you mean, where it's like we try to psychoanalyze texts written by people, and we don't know what's in somebody else's head. And we're trying to essentially read these thoughts in there that aren't there.
And the only clue you have is what they actually wrote.
Yep.
And so you just have to go with what they wrote down instead of trying to read between the lines and all these pretend there's references to other works that the text doesn't say it's referring to. And yeah, exactly.
Well, actually, Ben, that brings us to our final question. The Bible says in Psalm 133, verse 1, "Behold, how good and pleasant it is when brothers dwell in unity." The Bible also says, "Test everything, hold fast what is good." Ben, this is a two-pronged question. If Craig were in the room right now, what would be some things that you'd like to discuss with him, and what words of encouragement do you have for the listeners?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I was in the Zoom class with Craig, but it was in a format where I was pretty much allowed to ask short questions and not really have a conversation. So it's a good thing to think about, and I did think about it a little bit, and I think I would try to talk to him about some of the things that were not in the book that I sort of picked up on through the last 3 years or so of interacting with his views on things. Um, and I would go back to what I said before about Craig sees his calling and his life mission as removing intellectual barriers to Christian faith. And that would be kind of like the dwell in unity aspect of the sort of tension that you described there, is that we're trying to sort of remove barriers to people so they can become Christians and become brothers in Christ. The question is, for us as young earth creationists, where is the line where you say, well, you can't be a Christian if you don't believe this? And young earth creationists have always agreed that this particular issue about the age of the earth and the interpretation of the first chapters of Genesis is not an essential issue to become a Christian, right? And so you can absolutely be a Christian and disagree with our position on this. So why do we consider it to be so important, right? And that's a really good question. And there's a lot of ways to answer that, but with Craig in particular, in the field of apologetics, C.S. Lewis, who I've mentioned before, is very influential, especially a book he wrote called Mere Christianity. And Lewis has been interpreted often by modern apologists to be making this kind of argument that Craig is making, right? And it's often referred to explicitly in the context of origins. So, for example, William Dembski, who's an intelligent design theorist but old Earth creationist, he wrote a book called Mere Creation, which is explicit reference to mere Christianity. And there was a theistic evolutionist that I mentioned earlier, Michael Murray, who was at the panel, the ETS panel with Craig in November, also has written a paper that has been called Mere Theistic Evolution recently on Joshua Swamidas's website. That paper, which was originally presented at the 2019 ETS panel with people like Craig was there, and so were Stephen Meyer and Paul Nelson. Were at that meeting. And it was really to present Murray's idea, which has been called mere theistic evolution. Like, here is the basic idea of theistic evolution, which Craig seems to support, at least theologically. His objections to this view are all scientific, and these are his own words, right? But theologically, these people are allowed to be Christians because this is basically okay with Christian doctrine, including the doctrine of creation, which says God created, and all of the rest. So there's all this sort of implicit reference to defining the outward boundaries of Christianity and saying that as long as we have this boundary and we go up to it but no further, that's okay. So you can walk right up to the edge, and Craig wants to define that edge and say, as long as you don't step over the precipice, you're okay. And so I'm thinking in my mind of Christianity as a mesa or a plateau, where it's a flat land that's raised above all the rest of the land, and there's this cliff on all sides. And if you fall off the cliff, you're no longer a Christian, right? And so what Craig is trying to do is define the boundaries and say, look, as long as you don't cross this boundary, you're okay, right? That's That's what his understanding of mere Christianity is. But I want to read a little bit from the preface of Mere Christianity, the actual book by C.S. Lewis, to show you that's not what C.S. Lewis meant by mere Christianity. I hope no reader will suppose that mere Christianity is here put forward as an alternative to the creeds of the existing communions, meaning the denominations, as if a man could adopt it in preference to Congregationalism or Greek Orthodoxy or anything else. It is more like a hall out of which doors open into several rooms. If I can bring anyone into that hall, I shall have done what I attempted. And again, this would be Craig's view of his own mission, is to bring people into the hallway of Christianity, to just be a mere Christian, and that's it. But Lewis says, it is in the rooms, not in the hall, that there are fires and chairs and meals. The hall is a place to wait in, a place from which to try the various doors, not a place to live in. For that purpose, the worst of the rooms, whichever that may be, is, I think, preferable. It is true that some people may find they have to wait in the hall for a considerable time, while others feel certain almost at once which door they must knock at. But you must regard it as waiting, not as camping. Okay? You must keep on praying for light. And of course, even in the hall, you must begin trying to obey the rules which are common to the whole house. And above all, you must be asking which door is the true door, which is the true one, not which pleases you best by its paint and paneling. In plain language, the question should never be, do I like that kind of service, like church service? But are these doctrines true? Is holiness there? Does my conscience move me towards this? Is my reluctance to knock at this door due to my pride or my mere taste or my personal dislike of this particular doorkeeper? When you have reached your own room, be kind to those who have chosen different doors and to those who are still in the hall. You know, if they're wrong, they need your prayers all the more. And if they are your enemies, then you are under orders to pray for them. That is one of the rules common to the whole house. And that's the end of his preface. And so he ends the preface with a strong argument that the hallway that he is trying to define is not where it's at in Christianity. And I would almost add to that, that if you stay walking along the precipice, along the edge of Christianity, you're much more likely to fall off than if you move towards the center of God's truth. And it's not just you, right? It's people that you might influence, and people who might have been in the center of Christianity, but came to the edge because you're there and you're walking the edge of the Christianity, and you're basically saying, I'm skilled enough and intelligent enough to not fall over the edge, right? But there are other people who aren't. And if you exude this kind of model to other Christians that, look at me, I can walk the edge and I'll be fine, instead of pursuing the center of God's truth, you're going to inspire other people to try that same tactic. And some of them are going to fall off. And I think that is actually, one of the biggest reasons why I think this issue is so important is because we should not be pursuing the bare minimum of what it means to correctly interpret the Bible. We should not be looking at the Bible as shackles that we need to sort of loosen in order to let us have more freedom and have more people be Christians. What we should be doing is looking at the Bible as a source of positive information that can lead us to the truth and lead us to the center of God's truth and guide us to the safe place, right, at the center of that mesa of Christianity, into at least one of the rooms that Lewis was talking about. It's the same concept. And that's where your faith becomes stronger and starts to grow. And if you spend too much time walking the edge, that'll have consequences. And I think it has had lots of consequences in the last 200 or 300 years in Western civilization, is that we've been walking on one of these precipices a little too close, and people are falling off, and Christianity is declining because we put science and authority over the Bible. And Craig himself might not fall off, right? I don't think he has. I think he's a Christian. But it was pretty clear from a lot of his appearances. He did a lot of appearances and YouTube shows and things like that during the pandemic. It was pretty clear that he was shaken a little bit by his inability to come to a firm conclusion on this issue. And I would just say, like, get into one of the rooms, Dr. Craig. Decide which one is the best one, which is the one you think is actually true. And that's what we should be heading towards as mature Christians. And we should also be modeling that to immature Christians, as Lewis argues, and probably did, is that you don't want to stay in the hallway. That's not what mere Christianity means. Mere Christianity is an attempt to find unity among the different rooms. It's not trying to say we should be really overly concerned about the hallway and what the hallway really is, and then stop thinking about it after that. So I hope Craig keeps thinking about it, and I hope all of you keep thinking about it, and further up and further in. That's Lewis's motto from The Great Divorce, another book he wrote. Get closer and closer to God, right? Closer and closer to God's truth is what we want to be pursuing as Christians, not walking on the edge.
Ben, thank you very much for your time. It was an absolute joy. And to our listeners, thank you very much for taking the time to learn with us on current topics in science, where scientific discoveries are examined in light of the origins issue. You can find Ben's biographical information and his video lecture series in the description below. Please share and subscribe to the Current Topics in Science podcast. It's available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcast, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Thanks again for listening, and remember, the truth saves.